They didn't just survive the music industry, they outlived it. While other groups burned bright and vanished, while solo stars flamed out under the weight of fame, contracts, addiction, and betrayal, the Isley Brothers kept going, decade after decade, sound after sound, era after era, and somehow, history still hasn't fully explained how. Because when people talk about the Isley Brothers, they talk about the songs. They talk about Shout. They talk about It's Your Thing. They talk about Between the Sheets. They don't talk about the losses. They don't talk about the reinvention. They don't talk about the quiet sacrifices it took to stay alive in an industry designed to discard black artists once the trend shifted. So the question becomes unavoidable. How did the Isleys do what so many others couldn't? Why did they survive Motown, psychedelic soul, funk, disco, quiet storm, and hip-hop sampling, while other legends were crushed somewhere along the way? And what did survival cost them? The Isley Brothers' story begins not in glamour, but in discipline, in church harmonies, in a household where music was both sanctuary and responsibility, where talent was nurtured, but survival was learned early. They came of age during a time when black artists were rarely protected, when contracts were traps, when ownership was an illusion, when success often meant being celebrated publicly while bleeding privately. They watched peers rise fast and fall hard. They watched bands fracture over money, ego, and industry manipulation. They watched solo stars get chewed up by fame and discarded when the sound changed. And still, the Isleys adapted. They didn't just evolve musically, they evolved strategically. They learned when to bend, when to fight, and when to disappear long enough to return stronger. But survival isn't the same as victory. Behind the longevity were fractures, legal battles, family tensions, creative power struggles, moments where the band nearly collapsed under its own history, moments where survival meant compromise, and moments where it nearly didn't happen at all. This isn't the story of a group that stayed lucky. It's the story of a group that stayed alive, in a business built to erase black genius once it ages, once it resists control, once it stops being profitable to others. The Isley Brothers did the unthinkable. They endured. This is the story of how and of what it took. This is the story they never fully told. Welcome to Legends of Soul, where the voices that shaped generations are finally heard in full. This is where we honor the builders, the survivors, and the overlooked architects of soul and R&B. Here, we go beyond the hits to uncover the cost of brilliance, the scars behind the sound, and the truths history left out. This isn't nostalgia, it's restoration. These are the legends they tried to outlast, and this is Legends of Soul, Chapter 1. Harmony forged before the world was watching, before there were stages, before there were contracts, before survival became a strategy. There was church, not the polished kind, not the glamorous kind people imagine when they hear gospel roots. This was discipline. This was repetition. This was standing still for hours, learning how to listen to one another before learning how to be heard. Ronald, O'Kelly, and Rudolph Isley learned harmony the way other kids learned obedience. Their voices were shaped in sanctuaries where mistakes were noticed, where timing mattered, where ego had no place to hide. You did not sing over your brother. You did not drift away from the blend. You stayed connected, or the sound collapsed. That lesson would quietly save them years later. Their parents believed music was a gift, but never a shortcut. Talent did not excuse preparation. Praise did not replace work. The Isleys were taught early that music could lift you spiritually, but it could also expose you, strip you bare, reveal who you really were when the applause stopped. So when they stepped outside the church and into the world of secular music, they were already guarded. The late 1950s and early 60s were not kind to young black vocal groups. The industry loved the sound, but not the people behind it. Groups were interchangeable. Voices were replaceable. Ownership was a myth whispered to keep artists compliant. The Isleys entered this world wide-eyed, but not naive. Their early years were unstable. Labels came and went. Singles hit and then disappeared. Shout exploded, but the explosion didn't come with protection. Fame arrived before structure. Recognition arrived before control. And quietly, the warning signs were already there. They saw how quickly success could turn predatory, how smiles disappeared once paperwork arrived, how other groups began arguing over money they didn't fully understand, how brotherhood fractured when the industry rewarded division. But the Isleys held on to something rare. They stayed a family first, not perfectly, not without tension, but with a shared understanding that survival meant unity, even when the road forward was unclear. They learned to move together, to retreat when necessary, to wait out moments instead of burning bridges. That patience was not passive. It was intentional, strategic, almost instinctive. And yet, even with that foundation, nothing guaranteed longevity. They were young, the industry was ruthless, and the sound of America was already changing faster than anyone could predict. What they didn't know yet was that this early discipline, this church-taught restraint, this instinct to protect the group before the spotlight, would soon be tested beyond imagination, because the next phase of their journey would force them to choose. Stay comfortable and disappear, or risk everything and transform. And once that door opened, there would be no going back. Chapter 2. When success came without safety. Success didn't arrive gently for the Isley Brothers. It arrived loud, public, unstable. By the early 1960s, their name was known, their voices were recognizable. Shout had become an anthem, a cultural eruption that crossed racial and generational lines. But behind the curtain, the machinery that turned songs into legends was already grinding against them. Motown saw potential. So did every other label circling black talent at the time. But potential did not mean protection. The Isleys entered a system where ownership was rare, contracts were opaque, and loyalty was one-sided. Hits brought visibility, not security. Money flowed, but never clearly toward the artists who earned it. And for groups especially, success came with an unspoken expiration date. You were valuable until the sound shifted, until the market changed, until someone younger arrived. The Isleys watched this happen in real time. They saw peers get shelved, watched groups dissolve over publishing disputes they barely understood, saw artists celebrated on stage while quietly drowning off it. The industry rewarded the image of brotherhood, but profited from its collapse. And inside their own camp, pressure mounted. They were successful, but not stable. Famous, but not free. Every move felt borrowed. Every hit felt conditional. The question lingered unspoken but heavy. How long before this ends? This was the era when many groups cracked, when resentment grew quietly and exploded publicly, when brothers stopped trusting brothers, when managers and labels inserted themselves between bloodlines. But the Isley Brothers did something unusual. They pulled back. Instead of chasing the spotlight harder, they studied the business that kept tightening around them. They learned where the money disappeared. They learned how publishing worked. They learned that survival required more than talent. It required control. That decision didn't come without cost. Stepping back meant risking relevance. Silence in the music industry often feels like surrender. And for black artists, absence was usually permanent. But the Isleys were already thinking beyond the moment. They understood something many artists learned too late. Trends pass. Ownership doesn't. Sounds change. Leverage lasts. This wasn't fear. It was foresight. Still, walking away from momentum is never painless. There were doubts, internal debates, quiet moments where the future felt dangerously uncertain, where choosing patience felt like gambling with everything they'd built, and the industry didn't wait kindly. Doors closed, calls slowed, interest cooled, but what looked like retreat was preparation. Because when the Isleys returned, they wouldn't be asking for permission. They would be rewriting the rules, and the sound they were about to unleash would shock everyone who thought they were finished. Chapter 3. Reinvention as an Act of Survival. When the Isley Brothers returned, they didn't sound like anyone remembered. The sweet harmonies were still there, but now they were wrapped in distortion, in urgency, in grit. Guitars screamed where polish once lived. The music felt sharper, darker, hungrier. It wasn't an accident. By the late 1960s, America was changing fast. The optimism of the early soul era was giving way to unrest. Civil rights victories had not brought safety. War filled television screens. Black artists were expected to provide comfort while living inside chaos themselves. Many groups couldn't make the transition. Their sound was frozen in time. Their audience aged. Their labels lost interest. The Isley Brothers chose transformation. With the arrival of Ernie and Marvin Isley, the group expanded not just in size, but in vision. Ernie's guitar brought a raw, psychedelic edge that placed the Isleys in conversation with rock, funk, and protest music all at once. Marvin's bass anchored the sound in something physical, something undeniable. This wasn't chasing trends, it was claiming space. It's Your Thing didn't just mark a new era for the Isleys. It declared independence from labels, from creative limitation, from the idea that black groups had to fit neatly into one lane to survive. But reinvention came with risk. Older fans were confused. Industry executives were nervous. Radio didn't know where to place them. The Isleys were now too loud for soul purists and too black for rock traditionalists. And yet, the music hit. Because it was honest. It spoke to autonomy, to self-definition, to taking ownership in a world that constantly denied it. The message resonated not because it was catchy, but because it was true. Behind the scenes, the pressure intensified. Running their own label meant bearing their own losses. Creative freedom came without a safety net. Every decision carried weight. Every misstep would land directly on them, and within the family, dynamics shifted. Younger members brought fresh energy. Older members carried history. Leadership had to be renegotiated. Respect had to be maintained without stifling evolution. This is where many bands fracture. When generations clash, when egos harden, when the future feels like a threat to the past. But the Isley Brothers did something rare. They made room. They allowed the sound to grow without erasing what came before. They understood that survival meant listening as much as leading. That staying alive creatively required trust. Success didn't erase vulnerability. The more powerful they became, the more visible they were. And visibility in this industry always attracts forces eager to take more than they give. What looked like triumph was also exposure. And the cost of staying ahead was about to rise. Chapter 4. The Illusion of Control. Midpoint re-engagement chapter. From the outside, it looked like the Isley Brothers had solved the impossible equation. They owned their sound. They controlled their label. They had reinvented themselves across eras while others vanished. But survival can create its own illusion, because control in the music industry is never absolute. It's negotiated, challenged, tested quietly and relentlessly. By the early 1970s, the Isleys were everywhere. Their music bridged protest and pleasure, funk and intimacy, defiance and romance. They were respected by rock musicians, embraced by soul audiences, and studied by younger artists looking for a blueprint. Yet, behind the success was a growing complexity no one talked about. Money was flowing, but so were obligations. Family ties were strong, but expectations were heavier. Creative freedom existed, but it demanded constant vigilance. Running a family band is one thing. Running a family business inside a predatory industry is another. As the group expanded, so did the fault lines. Creative decisions now carried financial consequences. Personal disagreements echoed into boardrooms. Every choice risked being interpreted not just as artistic direction, but as power. And then there was the question, no family band escapes forever. Who leads when everyone is essential? Ronald's voice remained the emotional center. Rudolph carried spiritual grounding. Ernie's guitar reshaped the sound. Marvin's bass anchored the groove. Each contribution was undeniable, each presence irreplaceable. But equality doesn't eliminate tension, it amplifies it. The more successful the Isleys became, the more the industry watched for weakness. Lawsuits didn't arrive loudly. They crept in through contracts, royalties, tax structures designed to confuse and exhaust. This is where the story turns darker, because survival doesn't protect you from exploitation. Sometimes it only delays it. The Isleys believed they had escaped the traps that destroyed others, and in many ways they had. But the system adapts. It waits. It finds new angles. Behind the scenes, financial strain mounted, not from lack of success, but from complexity. From success without infrastructure designed for long-term protection. From an industry that punished independence by making self-management dangerously complicated. And inside the family, silence began to replace conversation. Not because of hatred, because of exhaustion. Because holding everything together requires constant emotional labor. And even the strongest bonds is strained under years of pressure. This is the moment most people never hear about. The moment when survival stops feeling like triumph and starts feeling like maintenance, like vigilance, like fear of losing what you fought so hard to keep. Everything leading up to this point had been preparation. What followed would attest whether survival alone was enough, because the next era wouldn't threaten the Isleys creatively. It would threaten them legally, spiritually, and emotionally. And for the first time, endurance would not guarantee safety. Chapter 5, When the Weight Finally Shows. The Isley Brothers entered the late 1970s carrying something heavier than fame. They carried history. By now, they had done what few artists ever managed. They had crossed genres without losing credibility. They had stayed relevant without surrendering identity. They had built a catalog that felt timeless while still sounding of its moment. But longevity leaves marks. The music grew smoother, more intimate. Between the Sheets didn't shout defiance, it whispered closeness, vulnerability, desire softened by experience. The sound reflected men who had lived through cycles of pressure and release, public triumph and private fatigue. And behind that velvet surface, reality tightened its grip. Success had multiplied complexity. Touring, recording, business management, family expectations. All of it ran simultaneously, without pause. There was no clean separation between brother and bandmate, between artist and executive, between loyalty and responsibility. The strain didn't explode. It accumulated. Fatigue showed up in small ways. Missed conversations. Decisions deferred. Trust assumed instead of reaffirmed. The kind of quiet erosion that rarely looks dangerous until suddenly it is. And then came the reckoning the industry saves for later. Financial scrutiny intensified. Paperwork that once seemed manageable now felt overwhelming. Systems built without long-term protection began to buckle under their own weight. What had been independence started to resemble isolation. The Isleys were not alone in this. Many black artists who fought for control were punished not openly, but administratively, by complexity, by laws written without them in mind, by an industry that offered freedom but no map for sustaining it. Inside the group, emotional distance grew, not because love faded, because survival demanded silence. Everyone was tired. Everyone was carrying something they didn't know how to put down. And in families, unspoken burdens don't disappear. They ferment. Publicly, the Isleys still appeared unbreakable. The music flowed, the legacy expanded. Younger artists studied their records. DJs leaned on their grooves. Privately, cracks widened. This is where many stories collapsed dramatically, with scandal, with betrayal, with spectacle. But the Isley Brothers' fracture came differently. It came through legal corridors, through paperwork and courtrooms, through consequences that didn't care about legacy or intention. The sound never warned us, but the silence did. And once it arrived, there was no harmony strong enough to keep the outside world from stepping in. What followed would separate survival from endurance and test whether legacy could survive consequences no song could soften. Chapter 6, Survival After the Fall. When the fall came, it wasn't loud. There was no final concert collapse, no dramatic onstage goodbye, no single moment the world could point to and say, this is when it ended. It unraveled the way real life does, quietly, legally, permanently. The early 1980s brought consequences the Isley Brothers could not sing their way out of. Financial missteps, mounting tax issues, and the brutal reality of operating independently inside a system never designed for Black-owned success finally caught up with them. The courts did not care about legacy. They did not care about innovation. They did not care about decades of cultural contribution. They cared about numbers. The group's business empire collapsed under scrutiny. Records that once represented freedom now symbolized exposure. The independence they fought for became the very thing used against them. And then came the moment that broke the illusion completely. Ronald Isley went to prison. For many artists, that would have been the end, not just of a career, but of a name, of dignity, of relevance. History is littered with stories that stop right there, but this is where the Isley Brothers defied expectation again. Because survival, for them, was never just about success. It was about endurance. While Ronald was incarcerated, the silence around the Isleys grew heavy. The industry moved on quickly. New sounds emerged, new stars filled the vacuum, and once again, the message was clear. There is no waiting period for fallen legends. And yet, something unexpected happened. The music didn't disappear. DJs kept playing the records. Younger artists kept sampling the grooves. Hip-hop, a genre built on memory and reinterpretation, reached backward and pulled the Isleys forward into a new generation. Their work became infrastructure, not nostalgia, foundation. Songs like Between the Sheets were reborn through sampling, not as relics, but as living material. Their sound threaded through modern records, even when their names weren't spoken aloud. This was survival without visibility. And inside the family, the bond held. Not perfectly, not painlessly, but intact enough to believe in return. Because survival, they had learned, does not always mean staying visible. Sometimes it means staying alive long enough to be rediscovered. When Ronald emerged, older, quieter, altered, the industry did not rush to apologize. There were no redemption speeches waiting, no guarantees of relevance. But there was something else. Time. And the Isley Brothers had already proven they knew how to wait. Chapter 7. The Quiet Power of Outlasting Time. By the time the Isley Brothers returned to public life, the world had changed again. The industry no longer revolved around bands. Radio was fragmented. The album was losing power. Youth culture moved fast, with little patience for history. For many artists of their era, this shift was fatal. They became footnotes, sample sources, names spoken only in liner notes, if at all. But the Isleys did not return asking to reclaim the spotlight. They returned with something rarer, perspective. Ronald Isley's voice had aged, but it hadn't weakened. It carried weight now, experience, a kind of quiet authority that couldn't be manufactured. When he sang, it wasn't about proving relevance. It was about presence. And younger artists noticed. Not because the Isleys chased them, but because influence doesn't need permission. R. Kelly built entire albums around Ronald's voice. Hip-hop producers treated Isley records like sacred text. Neo-soul artists borrowed their emotional restraint, their pacing, their refusal to rush intimacy. The Isley Brothers became elders without ceremony, no coronation, no apology tour, no industry acknowledgement of what had been taken, just survival. They performed when they wanted, collaborated when it felt right. They no longer bent to trends. They let the music speak on its own terms. And still, the cost lingered. Family relationships carried scars that never fully healed. Losses remained unresolved. The weight of decades spent defending their work, their name, their unity, never completely lifted. Longevity isn't clean. It doesn't tie itself up neatly. It leaves questions behind. Why did it take incarceration for the industry to stop exploiting them? Why did independence come with punishment instead of protection? Why were they celebrated only after being broken? These are not questions the Isleys ever answered publicly. They didn't need to. Their endurance was the response. In a culture that discards black artists once they age, once they refuse control, once their sound outgrows its market category, the Isley Brothers stood quietly against erasure. They didn't rewrite history. They outlasted it. And in doing so, they became something more powerful than legends. They became proof. Proof that survival itself can be radical, that longevity can be resistance, that staying whole, even imperfectly, can be an act of defiance. Their story was never about winning. It was about remaining, and the industry never quite knew what to do with artists who refused to disappear. Next comes the reckoning. Not a summary, a confrontation with what the Isley Brothers gave the world, and what the world failed to give back. Chapter 8. Legacy Without Apology. The Isley Brothers' legacy does not sit comfortably. It doesn't resolve itself into a neat ending. It doesn't offer a moral that fits cleanly on a plaque or a tribute reel. It lingers. It questions. It unsettles. Because their influence is everywhere, and their recognition never fully matched it. Their fingerprints are embedded in modern music so deeply that they've become invisible. Funk grooves, quiet storm intimacy, psychedelic soul, hip-hop sampling culture, neo-soul restraint, all of it carries Isley DNA. Entire careers were built on sounds the Isleys pioneered, refined, and survived long enough to see reborn. And yet, for decades, others benefited more visibly. Labels built wealth from their independence experiments. Younger artists gained cultural capital sampling their work. The industry celebrated innovation while ignoring the cost paid by the innovators themselves. This is the uncomfortable truth the Isley story forces us to confront. Black genius is often welcomed, but rarely protected. Black innovation is celebrated, but frequently extracted. And black pioneers are praised most loudly once they no longer threaten power. The Isley Brothers didn't disappear because they lacked relevance. They faded from the industry's center because they refused to be controlled. Their story exposes a contradiction the music business still hasn't resolved. We honor longevity rhetorically, but structure systems that punish it. We praise ownership, but leave artists alone to navigate legal and financial traps designed to exhaust them. So, what does recognition mean when it arrives late? Awards came eventually. Tributes followed. Their name entered halls of fame, but none of it restored what was lost. None of it erased prison time. None of it healed family strain or repaid years of emotional labor spent simply staying intact. And still, the Isleys never demanded apology. They didn't rewrite their narrative loudly. They didn't stage redemption arcs for public comfort. They let the music, the endurance, and the influence speak. That restraint is part of their legacy too. They showed that survival doesn't require validation. That sometimes the most radical act is to remain standing long enough for history to catch up. But history is slow, and justice even slower. So the question remains open. Who profits from black brilliance when the pioneers are gone? Why do the architects so often become footnotes? And how many stories like the Isley Brothers are still half told, softened, or ignored? Their legacy is not finished. It is ongoing, unresolved, demanding honesty. And that may be the most powerful thing they ever left behind. At the beginning of this story, we asked how the Isley Brothers survived every era while others fell apart. Now we know the answer wasn't luck, it wasn't timing, and it wasn't protection. It was discipline learned in church pews, unity tested by industry pressure, reinvention chosen over comfort, and endurance practiced when recognition disappeared. They survived by understanding something most artists never get the chance to learn, that the music industry does not reward longevity, it challenges it. The Isley Brothers didn't just make songs we remember. They made music that stayed alive long enough to find new meaning in new hands. Their work became memory, foundation, and inheritance. Maybe you remember the first time you heard Shout, or the way Between the Sheets sounded late at night, or the moment you realized a modern song carried a groove you'd heard before, even if you didn't know where. That recognition matters, because legacy doesn't live in trophies, it lives in connection. The Isleys matter not because they endured trends, but because they carried humanity through them. They remind us that brilliance often comes with cost, that survival is rarely glamorous, and that staying whole in a system built to fracture you is an act of quiet rebellion. Their story doesn't ask for pity. It asks for truth. And if this story moved you, sit with it. Let it linger. Let it complicate what you think you know about success, about ownership, about who gets remembered and why. Because the next story we tell will ask even harder questions. A voice so powerful, it shook the soul of a generation. A genius whose pain bled through every note. And a man the industry still doesn't know how to reckon with, Donny Hathaway. Another legend the world loved, and then failed. This has been Legends of Soul.